On the rocky shore at Wied iż-Żurrieq, the recovery winch stopped before the job was finished. A broken section of a Second World War fighter was hanging between sea and land, still wrapped in fishing nets after more than half a century underwater. The lifting bag had brought it to the surface. The tow had carried it close to shore. But the machinery available on the rocks could pull it no farther. So 4 ropes were tied to the wreck. Divers, volunteers, and people who had come only to watch took hold. Roughly 10 to 15 people lined each rope. Together, they pulled the twisted rear fuselage and tail across the final distance. Once the nets were cut away, 8 men lifted the recovered section onto Ray Polidano's Land Rover. It was the 16th of July, 1995. For the first time since the summer of 1941, a substantial part of Hawker Hurricane Z3055 was back on Malta. But the engine, cockpit, and center section were still lying about 40 meters below the sea. The aircraft had reached Malta only weeks before it disappeared. Z3055 was a Hawker Hurricane Mark IIA, built at Kingston and powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin 20. It had moved through several British maintenance units before being sent south during the summer of 1941, when Malta was urgently trying to strengthen its fighter defense. The island's fighter force was changing quickly. Aircraft arrived, units were reorganized, and pilots were expected to become familiar with machines that might have been on Malta for only a few days. On the 26th of June, Flight Lieutenant H.P. Lardner Burke flew Z3055 for about 50 minutes. 2 days later, No. 126 Squadron was formed at Takali from personnel associated with No. 46 Squadron. Among the pilots serving with the new unit was Sergeant Thomas Haxton. He was 23 years old. The Hurricane was not an exhausted veteran when Haxton climbed into it. It had been on the island for only a short time. Its basic design, however, came from an earlier generation of fighter construction. The Hurricane combined metal structure with wooden formers and fabric covering. That mixture made the aircraft practical to build and repair during wartime. Decades later, it would also determine what the sea could destroy and what restorers could save. Before dawn on the 4th of July, 1941, Haxton took off from Safi Airfield in Z3055. Accounts placed the departure at about 3:45 in the morning, before dawn had reached Malta. Later descriptions call the flight a routine air test. Within minutes, the Hurricane came down in the sea south of the island. Haxton did not return. No body was recovered. The exact cause of the accident has never been established. Later accounts have suggested an engine failure, a seizure, or a fire. When the wreck was eventually raised, one bank of cylinders showed signs of severe overheating. That made a serious engine problem plausible. It did not prove the full sequence of events before impact. The surviving record does not explain what Haxton did in the final moments. There is no evidence strong enough to show whether he remained in the cockpit or escaped before the aircraft sank. The sea preserved parts of the machine. It did not preserve an answer. Z3055 settled beyond the reach of wartime recovery. At about 40 meters, roughly 130 feet, it was deep enough to disappear from ordinary view, but shallow enough to remain within the reach of experienced divers many years later. Time changed the aircraft slowly. Fishing nets snagged on the wreck. The rear fuselage twisted and separated. Part of the wing structure was lost or damaged. Salt water worked through the engine, cockpit, and joints throughout the airframe. The aircraft did not vanish completely. Its shape remained recognizable. But visible shape was not the same as strength. Thin aluminium could survive as a surface while losing the ability to carry a load. Steel components corroded. Wood and fabric deteriorated. The Hurricane remained on the seabed as an aircraft in outline, while many of the materials that had once made it a working machine were being destroyed. For more than 50 years, Z3055 lay south of Malta without a known identity. Fishing crews knew that something below could catch their nets, but the object itself remained part of the seabed rather than part of recorded aviation history. In 1993, divers Carmenu Grixti and John Spiteri encountered the wreck. The object projecting from the seabed did not immediately look like the tail of a fighter. The broken fuselage had been mistaken for part of an old crane or another piece of industrial debris. The divers reported the find to professional diver David Shembri. A local fisherman, Carminu Caruana, already knew of an underwater obstruction in the area and helped mark the position. Shembri then descended to the site, recorded video, and retrieved 2 instruments from the cockpit. Even after that first close inspection, the aircraft was not immediately identified. A fighter lying off Malta invited one obvious guess. Some believed it might be a Spitfire. Shembri later remembered studying the English wording on the equipment. "Had the wordings been in German, I probably would have opted for a Stuka," he said. The comment captured the uncertainty of the first survey. A wreck stripped of paint and damaged by decades underwater could not be identified by silhouette alone. Ray Polidano and Mike Eastman examined the surviving structure and recognized features of a hurricane. That answered the first question. It did not answer the most important one. Malta had seen many hurricanes during the war. Which aircraft was this? The objective was no longer simply to inspect the wreck. The group now wanted to bring the hurricane ashore, establish its identity, and preserve what remained. But there was no single intact airframe waiting to be lifted. The wreck had to be understood section by section before anyone could decide how to move it. For roughly 2 years, the team recovered small and accessible parts while learning more about the site. The windscreen, battery, radio equipment, and cockpit instruments were among the items brought up. Each dive made the condition of the wreck clearer. The rear fuselage had already separated from the heavier forward section. Nets were wrapped around the aircraft. The engine, cockpit, and center section formed a much more difficult load than the broken tail. Trying to bring everything up in one operation would have meant controlling objects of different weight and condition at the same time. The team chose a 2-stage recovery. The detached rear section would come first. Divers attached a lifting bag rated for about 1.5 tons. The bag reduced the load underwater and carried the wreck toward the surface, but it did not solve every problem. Once the section was afloat, it still had to be controlled, towed, and moved onto land without breaking apart. That plan led to the scene at Wied iż-Żurrieq on the 16th of July, 1995. The tail reached the rocks, the winch stopped. 4 ropes replaced the missing mechanical force. People who had no role in the dive became part of the recovery. The section came ashore. For those standing beside it, the wreck now offered a first physical sense of what the sea had done. The hurricane's shape was still visible, but the metal was damaged, the structure was incomplete, and the nets had become part of the object that had to be removed. It was evidence of an aircraft, not an aircraft that could simply be reassembled. The first lift was a victory, but it also showed the limit of the method. The lighter part could be raised with a bag, towed toward land and dragged over the final distance. The forward wreck could not. The engine alone made the center section a different problem. Around it remained the cockpit, the central wing structure, and whatever portions of the wings had survived. The team used the lifting bag again, not to recover the whole mass, but to raise and move it a short distance. That allowed divers to inspect the seabed underneath and search for loose pieces. This was also a test. If the wreck could be shifted without collapsing, a larger lifting system might recover it. If it broke apart, the team would be left with fragments spread across the seabed, and far less certainty about what could still be preserved. Charles Tonti assisted with the next stage. Anthony Cassar, of Cassar Ship Repair Enterprises, provided a salvage barge named Seawolf. It carried an A-frame and a crew experienced in lifting heavy objects from the water. The operation was planned for the 19th of September, 1995. The forecast suggested conditions suitable for the work. The weather that arrived was worse. Wind moved across the site. Waves worked against the barge. Rain swept across an already difficult operation. But the team now had equipment designed for the load in front of them. Unlike the shore winch, the A-frame could lift the wreck directly beside the barge and control it as it broke the surface. Divers worked below while the barge held position above them. The wreck had to be secured as a single weakened load. The heavy Merlin, cockpit, and center section could not be treated as separate museum pieces until they were safely out of the water. The rigging took the load, and the main section of the Hurricane began to move from the seabed. For more than half a century, the engine and center structure had rested underwater. Now the corroded center section, cockpit, and Merlin rose together. The team had to bring the weakened wreck through the surface and onto the barge without allowing its surviving structure to collapse under a load it had not carried in decades. The first stage of recovery had ended with people pulling on ropes from shore. The second depended on machinery, positioning, and control. The objective was the same, but the margin for error had narrowed. If the center section failed during the lift, the pieces carrying the aircraft's identity might be lost or separated from their context. Within about an hour, the center section, cockpit, and engine were brought onto Seawolf. The aircraft had left the seabed. The wreck reached the barge, and the recovery achieved its principal objective. Seawolf carried the remains to iż-Żurrieq, and the aircraft was then transported to Takali. The people involved had raised a hurricane. They still did not know whether they had raised Z3055 or another aircraft lost in the same war. Paint could no longer provide a reliable answer. External markings had been erased, damaged, or separated from the airframe. The location alone was not enough. The aircraft needed evidence that had survived within the wreck itself. During cleaning and examination, the team found a brass plate and 2 aluminum panels carrying identifying numbers. The serial was Z3055. The metal linked the recovered wreck to the hurricane that had taken off from Safi before dawn on the 4th of July, 1941. It linked the cockpit to Thomas Haxton and the anonymous wreck to a specific loss recorded more than 50 years earlier. Identification changed the meaning of everything that had been recovered. The instruments were no longer simply hurricane instruments. The twisted tail was no longer merely part of an aircraft found off Malta. The wreck belonged to a known machine and a known final flight. It did not solve the final mystery. The canopy and side escape panel were not found in their expected positions. That allowed the possibility that Haxton had left the cockpit before the aircraft sank. But nets had struck the wreck, the rear fuselage had broken, and decades of movement and corrosion had disturbed the airframe. Those missing parts could not reveal when or why they had been displaced. There was still no body. There was still no reliable account of Haxton reaching the surface. The evidence supported a question, not an answer. The recovery had identified the hurricane. Restoration now revealed a different problem. Underwater, the wreck had looked remarkably complete. On land, once salt, corrosion, and damaged material were examined piece by piece, the appearance of completeness began to disappear. The original Merlin 20 was in very poor condition. Salt water had reached internal surfaces and remained there for decades. A small number of parts could be retained or used, but the engine could not simply be cleaned, rebuilt, and returned as the complete power plant Haxton had flown. The wings presented the same contradiction. Some ribs survived, but much of the main spar structure had been destroyed beyond safe reuse. A corroded component could still look like an aircraft part while no longer being able to support an aircraft. The wooden formers and fabric covering had also failed to survive in usable condition. Their loss was almost total, but their absence had been less obvious when the aircraft was first seen underwater. Those light materials had once shaped large parts of the fuselage. Without them, the recovered metal framework could not reproduce the hurricane's complete outline. The work that followed could not be limited to cleaning and conserving what had come out of the water. If the recovered pieces were to regain the recognizable form of a hurricane, missing structure had to be built around them. That decision carried its own responsibility. Replacing too little would leave a collection of damaged fragments that most visitors could not read as an aircraft. Replacing too much without clear documentation could blur the line between surviving material and modern reconstruction. The project therefore became a reconstruction as well as a restoration. The surviving airframe and its confirmed identity formed the foundation. New materials, donor parts, and work based on original drawings supplied what the sea had destroyed. The result would preserve Z3055 without pretending that every visible component had been pulled from the water. Drawings and blueprints were obtained from Britain. Laurie Borg manufactured new wooden formers. The fuselage was covered again with fabric, treated with dope, and painted. Hawker restorations assisted with missing wing components. Some original ribs could be used. Much of the structure around them had to be made again or supplied from other sources. The work demanded more than replacing large, obvious pieces. Every surviving component had to be judged. Some parts could be cleaned and conserved. Others could remain only as patterns. A damaged fitting might show the correct shape, but be too weak to carry a load. A corroded panel might preserve a hole pattern or manufacturing detail, even when the metal itself could not return to the aircraft. As the Hurricane regained its shape, its central contradiction became clearer. The surviving metal preserved its identity, while replacement structure restored its form. The engine gave the clearest example. Paul Cardona donated a Merlin 224. It was not the original Merlin 20 from Z3055. It was a more complete engine that could form the basis of an operating installation. The team combined it with usable components from other sources and whatever parts could appropriately be retained from the recovery project. On the 13th of December 2001, the assembled Merlin ran. The sound was real. The work was real. But it was not the untouched voice of the engine that had carried Haxton away from Safi. It was the result of reconstruction, donor material, and mechanical skill. That distinction did not reduce the achievement, it defined it. The people who raised Z3055 had not found an aircraft waiting to be restarted. They had found evidence strong enough to preserve an identity. Restorers then rebuilt the machine around that evidence. Today, Z3055 stands indoors at the Malta Aviation Museum at Takali. From a distance, it appears as a complete Hawker Hurricane. The wings are in place, the fuselage has its familiar shape, the Merlin sits beneath the cowling. Some of what the visitor sees came from the aircraft recovered off Malta. Some came from donor components. Much was manufactured again from drawings because saltwater had removed any other choice. Calling it perfectly original would ignore the scale of the reconstruction. Calling it merely a replica would ignore the serial-bearing wreck, the recovered structure, and the direct connection to Thomas Haxton. Its meaning lies between those two extremes. The first large section of Z3055 returned to Malta behind 4 ropes and a stopped winch. The rest came aboard Seawolf 2 months later. What emerged from the water was not an aircraft ready to be restored. It was the damaged physical record of one. At Takali, the Hurricane appears complete again because new structure was built around what survived. Its shape came from drawings, donor parts, and patient reconstruction. Its identity came from the metal raised from the sea. The sea returned enough to name the aircraft. It did not return enough to rebuild it without replacement.